could dance forever. I wanna fly with airplane arms out wide through galaxies of light. I have found my future. You make me feel like I've never been so high. When I look into your eyes, I see heaven. You make me feel like I'm lost in paradise, like I'm never gonna die. You are heaven. I wanna spin like a windmill in the sky on the carousel divine. I could spin forever. I want a tree in colors never seen, undiscovered melodies we will sing together. You make me feel like I've never been so high. When I look into your eyes, I see heaven. You make me feel like I'm lost in paradise, like I'm never gonna die. You are heaven. Falling in love, falling in love, falling in love, I'm falling in love, falling in love, falling in love, falling in love, I'm falling in love. I can't help falling in love with you. I can't help falling in love, falling in love. I can't help falling in love with you. I can't help falling in love. I'm falling in love. You make me feel like I've never been so high. When I look into your eyes, I see heaven. You make me feel like I'm lost in paradise, like I'm never gonna die. You are heaven.
Good morning. Welcome to Paradox. If you haven't met yet, we are Peter and Martha Matson. And at this time, we want to acknowledge both the absence and presence of God in our lives as we reflect on our week here. If it's your first time here, you can participate by pulling out your phone and going to pullev.com/paradox and sending in your anonymous celebrations and laments. And if you are joining us online, we'd also invite you this time to send those in with us.
All right, so I'm really excited to get us started with our celebration. So today, Peter and I are celebrating that we'll be going to a baby shower this afternoon for some dear friends. And we're just really excited to watch them celebrate them becoming new parents and meet their little one later this year. So at this time, we welcome you all to get out your phones and send in your anonymous celebrations so we can celebrate with you.
invite you to stand as we sing this next song.
Take me back to the garden. Lead me back to the moment I heard your voice. Take me back to communion. Lead me back to the moment I saw your face. And it was all so simple. It was easy to love. No space between us. It was easy to trust. 'Cause you are closer, closer than my skin. And you are in the air I'm breathing in. Where the dead things come back to living. I feel my heart beating again. It feels so good to know you are my friend. And this is the garden, here in the place I thought you close. This is communion, here in the place I'm fully known. And it was all so simple. You're so easy to love. No space between us. You're so easy to trust. 'Cause you are closer, closer than my skin. You are. And you are in the air I'm breathing in. And here's where the dead things come back to living. I feel my heart beating again. It feels so good to know you are my friend, my friend, my friend. It's where I'm meant to be. And this is where I'm meant to be. Me and you and you and me. And I don't have to prove a thing, no. You've already approved of me. This is where, and this is where I'm meant to be. Oh, me and you and me. I don't have to prove a thing. You've already approved of me. This is where I'm meant to be. Oh, me and you and me. Yeah.
this last week, I was up in Washington, in the Seattle area, and the whole time I was up there, the air was terrible. We had a lot of smoke in the air, and I was talking to some of my coworkers up there, and they told me that it had been 10 days since they'd been able to go outside to just, go out on walks or exercise because the air had been so bad. So today I'm lamenting forest fires. At this time, we invite you to send in your anonymous laments.
Will we ever rise? Will we ever rise above the fear? Can we learn to see the need? Can we share humanity? I can see another day come. Broken people, we can be made whole. We can be made whole. We can be made whole. As we lay down our weapons, open up our hearts. Love is breaking us. Love remaking us. Will we ever rise? Will we we can be made whole. Broken people, we can be made whole. We can be made whole. We can be made whole as we lay down our weapons, open up our hearts. Love is breaking us, love remaking us. Will we ever rise? Will we ever rise above?
Please bow your heads. Dear God, we just sang 2 songs about 2 opposing realities. The first song was about your presence, and the second song was about your absence. For the days we feel your presence, we thank you. Thank you for the beauty, the wonder, the awe, and the gift of this life. And for the days we feel your absence, we thank you. Thank you for how these days reveal the complete picture of who you are. May we have the maturity to see and to understand that you are paradoxically present, even in your absence. In the human name of Jesus, in the eternal name of Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much to Jasmine, Laurel, and the rest of the band for leading us through Lamentations and celebrations. And to all of you for sharing what it is that you have been going through during this week and what's going on in your life. At this time, I just want to say a special thank you to all who have made Paradox possible by donating at paradoxgiving.com. Thank you. Your generosity continues to blow me away on a weekly basis. Next week is a very special Sabbath and a very special service here at Paradox. We are doing our Pride Sabbath, which is entitled this year, Anatomy of a Queer Faith. Esther Loan has been coordinating this with our queer attendees and members, and we'd love for you to join us next Saturday at 10 a.m. It will be a service that I do not think you will forget for some time. And that leads us to today's sermon, which, if this is your first time here, welcome. We are glad that you are here. Something that's different about Paradox than other churches is that sermons here are designed to start discussions and not end them. It's okay if you disagree with what I'm about to say. We're talking about something that's very difficult, which means you'll most likely disagree with a large portion of what I say. Not only that, but we're talking today about loving our enemies, which is a difficult task. And so after the sermon, there will be a Q&A session. It will be hosted by Olivia Moses. She has heard the outline of the sermon. She's coming up with 3 questions that she's thought of ahead of time. And then we'll open it up to your questions to see if there's things that I can help talk about or discuss in community as to what it looks like to love our enemies. So you can send that into pollev.com/paradox. And I want you to know there will be a time after the sermon for you to send those questions in. Now, a quick disclaimer, I have not seen these questions ahead of time, so I may not give a polished and pretty answer, but I will do my best to try and have this in conversation and work through it, and so it requires a little bit of grace on your part. But at the same time, I want you all to know it's a lot more fun if you all ask questions. So we want to invite you to participate in that. Lastly, we have discussion groups that meet on a weekly basis. We have 8 different groups. Today, there is a group right after church that will be discussing the ideas in this sermon more in depth. Warren Peters will be leading it. He's right over here, and it will meet right after the service. He'll be up here, and they'll go upstairs and discuss these ideas if you just want to drop in and get to know some more people at Paradox. Which brings us to our sermon series that is Loving. And today, we are talking about a story that took place 2,000 years ago on a hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee, which if you went there today, it would look something like this. Jesus began to preach a sermon that would later be known as the Sermon on the Mount. And about a third of the way through the sermon, he said to the people gathered on this hillside, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor." Now, because Jesus is speaking to a Jewish audience, the Jews would know immediately where Jesus got this from. The book of Leviticus, where God spoke from this tent to Moses and gave Moses all sorts of commandments and rules for what it meant to be a holy people. One of these commandments was God saying to Moses, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So when Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor, everyone would have thought, oh, he's talking about Leviticus. Then Jesus goes on to say, and hate your enemy. Now, there is no verse in the Bible that says hate your enemy, but there are several verses that are very close. And in my opinion, the strongest one is found in Psalm 139, which is personally my favorite psalm, except for a couple verses, which we'll talk about here. Psalm 139 is the psalm that talks about how we are fearfully and wonderfully made and how God knew me and formed me and God understood who I was. Psalm 139 then turns a dark turn when David says, do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. So Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor, which is a quote from Scripture, and hate your enemy, which is a paraphrase. But then Jesus decides to turn the phrase on its head by saying to them, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, I have a feeling that people, when they heard this, thought to themselves, oh no, he's not talking about them, is he? And they sort of lean forward because they say to themselves, he's not surely he's not going to deep six this entire sermon by telling us that we need to love those people, right? So Jesus continues, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven, for God makes God's sun rise on the evil and on the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Now, this may seem like an innocuous statement to you, but I have to tell you, this was a revolutionary theological idea in Jesus' day. The reason for this is because if you go back before the scientific method, there was this sense that when a drought occurred, the only reason was because God was angry with you. After all, God is in charge of sending the rains here and there, and the winds blow there and there. If God wants a drought to occur in a spot, then God would will it to be so. So if you were experiencing a drought, you would assume that God was angry with you. Conversely, if you got lots of rain in one year and you saw that it was easy for crops to grow, you would assume that you were doing something right as a nation, right? You would assume that God was very happy with you, so the rain was viewed as a blessing. And then along comes Jesus, and he challenges this whole idea by saying, God makes God's sun rise on the evil and on the good, but also sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. In other words, Jesus says, God doesn't give you rain just because you earned it. Now, I imagine those people who have those questions in the back of their mind thinking to themselves, oh no, he's doing it. I am afraid that he's talking about them. And then in the very next verse, Jesus says, for if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And at this point, everyone says he is talking about them. Tax collectors. I knew it. And they can't believe he's talking about tax collectors because everyone who was listening to this sermon most likely hated tax collectors. Now, to understand why that is, we have to talk a little bit about the context of Jesus saying these words. And you have to go back to this time in first century Judea because first century Judea was under the jurisdiction of the Roman Empire. Now, the way the Romans collected taxes is through a system called tax farming, which if you look this up on Google Images, you will always find the shape of a pyramid because this is an ancient pyramid scheme. Now, at the top, you've got a governor who we'll call Maximus, who's a Roman governor of a province, and he oversees different people, like people in first century Judea, and these people have to pay tax to the Roman Empire. Let's pick two brothers. We're going to pick their names are Nadab and Abihu. So Nadab and Abihu have to pay taxes to Maximus. Maximus decides, okay, they owe $3,000 each. This will increase the funds of the Roman Empire by $6,000. Now, Maximus is obviously too big of a deal to go and collect these taxes. So Maximus says, we're going to have an auction for Roman citizens. Whoever wants to buy the rights to tax Nadab and Abihu, we're going to sell it to the highest bidder. So Commodus shows up, and Commodus, assuming if there were dollars, shows up, and he essentially bids for the right to collect taxes from the people of Judea. Now, let's just make up a number. Let's say he pays $75,000 to have the right to collect taxes from Nadab and Abihu and the other people of first century Judea. He wins it, he wins the contract, and of course, he's going to try to recover his costs. So on top of $6,000, Commodus wants another $3,000 for these two people, so he gets $3,000, and their tax bill, Nadab and Abihu, jumps to $4,500. Now, Eventually, Nadab and Abihu keep paying more and more taxes. They are being driven into poverty. I've seen estimates as low as 70% of Jews in first century Palestine, well, 70% of their income was taxed, up to 90%. That's the highest estimates I've seen. And eventually it drives people into poverty, as you can imagine. Well, once they are at their most desperate, Commodus goes to Nadab and says, hey, I see you're having a hard time feeding your family. What if I paid you to be a tax collector? What if you came and worked for the Roman Empire and you worked for me and we sent you to go collect taxes from people like your brother Abihu? And Nadab looks at his family and says, no, I could never do this. And then he says, you know what? I don't have many other choices. So he agrees to be Commodus' tax collector, and Commodus gets something very valuable in return. He protects himself from revolts by the Jewish peasants. Because Abihu is not going to fight against his brother Nadab. It would bring severe dishonor to his family, right? And so Nadab now stands between the Roman Empire and Abihu as a buffer for safety for Commodus. And Nadab here, at this point, they could say to him, hey, Commodus would say, Nadab, look, as much as you want to charge to collect taxes, I don't care as long as I get my $3,000, and then we also get the $6,000 to pass up to Maximus. So Nadab, who's poor now, goes to his brother Abihu, who is also poor, and says, I'm now a tax collector. I need you to pay $4,500, but I also need to make something, so you got to give me $1,500. And you can imagine the frosty exchange the first time a brother showed up to collect tax from a brother, but at the same time, Nadab is now backed up by the empire, and Abihu has to pay it. Now, Abihu would not violently revolt against his brother, but he and his family and his friends would all do the same protest in response to Nadab selling his soul to the Roman Empire. They would leave him alone and force him into social isolation. They were not allowed to come to birthday parties anymore. They had to spend holidays alone. And yes, Nadab all of a sudden became rich and brought his family out of poverty, but he did it all alone. And the only friends were other tax collectors who were willing to tax their friends and family. And so when Jesus mentions tax collectors here in the context of love your enemies, he's really specifically talking to these people about how they need to love their tax collector. And when you look at Jesus standing up in front of these people who all have one thing in common, they all hate tax collectors, and he's saying, do you really want to be on the same level as tax collectors? Do you really want to say, well, I love the people who love me? Because he's like, even tax collectors can do that, guys. I'm asking you to be something more. He goes on to ask the question, and if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the non-religious do the same? Be perfect, therefore, Jesus says, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Jesus then moves on to the second part of his sermon and leaves this idea alone. Now, it's important for us to understand what is going on here. When Jesus asks people to love their enemies, he is not speaking in general terms. In this sermon, Jesus asked people to love their specific enemies. And what that means is if you could imagine Jesus coming to speak at Paradox today, I have to ask the question to myself and also to you, what specific enemy of yours would Jesus ask you to love today? And I have to tell you that when I ask this question out loud, it's even hard for me to get it out of my mouth because I have a confession to make. I don't like loving my enemies. I don't enjoy loving my enemies. I kind of want the worst thing possible to happen to my enemies, right? And the fact is, I look out at all of you, and there are some very kind, wonderful people here, and I'm thinking to myself, I might be the worst person here to talk about loving enemies. I might have the worst qualifications and the worst track record. I don't know if I'm good at this. And I didn't really know how to approach this subject until recently I read a book by Barbara Brown Taylor, who is an ordained minister in the Episcopalian tradition. She was talking about what it was like to be ordained, and she paraphrased some advice from one of her friends. And she said, being an ordained minister is not about serving God perfectly, but about serving God visibly, allowing other people to learn whatever they can from watching you rise and also watching you fall. So I hope that what this comes across as when we talk about loving our enemies is not me standing on a stage saying, like, come on, you guys, get on my level. Instead, I hope it comes across as you and I sitting at a coffee shop saying, isn't it awful that Jesus asked us to love our enemies? Because I'm not sure how to do this. And if you are in that moment, and we were sitting in that moment together at a coffee shop over coffee, and we talked about the pain or the heartache that our enemies have caused us, and then we turn to each other, or you turn to me and say, like, what have you learned about loving your enemies? I would say, first of all, it's not easy. And second of all, I've learned a few things, but I'm not sure they're all the right answer. So for the rest of this sermon, or this conversation over coffee, I want to share with you what I have learned in 39 years of attempting to love my enemies. So if we go back to this time, Jesus stands up here and says, love your enemies, do whatever you can to pray for those who persecute you. Now I have to tell you, growing up in church and growing up in religion and also going to be a minister, I've heard these words, but I've also read my own interpretation into those words. While Jesus has said those exact things, I've heard other things like this: if you follow my teachings, then you will not have any enemies. It's almost like I hear Jesus implying that in his teaching, even though Jesus doesn't say it. I've also heard Jesus say, in God's eyes, there is no such thing as enemies. Act accordingly. Or I've heard Jesus say, avoid making your neighbor your enemy at all costs. I have some good news for us this morning. Jesus doesn't say any of those things. Jesus acknowledges a reality that you and I will face, and the fact that if you are human, at some point, you will have enemies. And I have to tell you that I am an ordained minister with a doctorate degree in religious studies, and I have enemies. And I know pastors aren't supposed to admit this out loud because pastors are supposed to love everyone, but I am a human being just like you. And when Jesus says in front of everybody, hey, you're gonna have enemies, it's okay. Try to learn how to love them. I have to look at what Jesus is really telling us, which is no matter how loving I am, I will still have enemies. And that's okay. It's okay if you've made somebody angry. It happens. It's part of being human. Not only that, but we also have to acknowledge the history of what it means to tell someone else to love your enemies. Jesus did not speak in a vacuum. He spoke to a specific context. And if you think about who Jesus was actually in this hierarchy with made-up names. Jesus was a poor peasant being taxed by tax collectors like Matthew to feed the Roman Empire. It is in this position that Jesus says, love your tax collector. Notice how different this would be if Jesus was himself a tax collector. If he showed up in Judea and said, hey, let me tell you who God is. God wants you to love your tax collector. Everyone would say, get out of here, man. That's ridiculous. How different would it be if Jesus was a Roman governor and he rolled in on a chariot and then declared an edict, you shall love your tax collector. No one would listen to him. But the fact is, Jesus is down here speaking to people like Abihu, whose own brother has sold him out, and he's telling him horizontally, we should learn how to love these guys because this current system of social isolation is just making things worse. I tell you all of this because when I talk about what I've learned about attempting to love my enemy, I've found that my enemy does not get to tell me that I need to love my enemy. If anyone here has an enemy that says, hey, aren't you a Christian? Shouldn't you love me? Shouldn't you love your enemy? Don't allow them to do that. That's against the rules. Conversely, it also means that I do not get to go tell my enemy that they need to love me. This is much more of a personal journey than it is using an external law to bend others to your will. Now, as far as the context behind this, Jesus specifically talks about tax collectors. And I have to tell you, I personally don't have a problem with tax collectors. I've never seen anybody walk into the IRS building and thought to myself, oh man, that's my enemy, right? But if you look at what Jesus was doing, he was speaking about an injustice for his day. And this world is filled with all kinds of injustice, isn't it? There's war, there's greed, there's anger, there's racism, there's homophobia, there's misogyny. There's all these different injustices that are real realities. And when we look at those things, there's always this temptation to look at Jesus saying, love my enemies or love your enemies, and think to yourself, you know what? He doesn't understand what I went through. He doesn't understand how bad this enemy is. And when we do that, we actually dismiss the suffering that Jesus and those Jewish peasants went through 2,000 years ago. We try to get into a competition and say, well, my suffering's so much worse. And at the same time, you look at other people who have had worse suffering than you, and it's rather surprising to see them say things like, I have found that the most valuable thing in times of war is to learn how to love my enemies. That is nearly a direct quote from the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who lived through apartheid and the genocide of Rwanda. He lived through it, and he still talks about forgiveness and the value of loving enemies, having seen the worst that humanity has to offer. Not only that, but I have to tell you, I know there are a lot of bad things that people do to each other. And yet, what I have found is in the worst stories of humanity, there are stories of redemption and people rising above what is bad to discover something good. What I have learned about loving my enemies is that while there is a lot of pain in loving our enemies, I have found that there is no sin beyond the redemption of God. I have found that no matter how much of a problem has been created by enemies, there is nothing that God cannot redeem and make something better out of. I have found that no matter how bad something is, you can always find a life that is bigger than just that thing. That sin, that anger, that pain does not have to define you for the rest of your life. And when I think about growing up in church, I went to a lot of church services. I was really committed to the church message. I was really committed to following God. And if anybody would have asked me for the majority of my life, up until about 25, Craig, how is it that you know you're a Christian? I would have said things like, I don't drink, I don't cheat, I don't do this thing, I don't do that thing. Now, I've started answering that question very differently. And when people ask me, how do you know you're a Christian? I would say, look, I'm really bad at this, but I know I'm a Christian because I keep coming back to this commandment, and I found that no matter how bad they are to me, I will still try to love my enemies. Now, you may think that I'm overemphasizing this commandment and overemphasizing this as a marker of what it means to be Christian. But I get this directly from the words of Jesus when he says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. In other words, if you want to be a child of God, the best way is to go out and love your enemies. That's the path of where God is leading us. And when I think about what Jesus is saying here, I think we can place this much emphasis on this commandment. The value of my Christian faith is measured by the way that I treat my enemies. That's how I know how much of a Christian I am. And if that sounds daunting to you, I want you to know it's daunting to me as well. I don't want you to see how I treat my enemies. I'd much rather have you see how I treat the people who love me, because that's where I really nail it, right? I do a much better job in that department than in the way that I treat my enemies. And this is a really difficult ask for Christians. It's so difficult, in fact, that when I hear Christians talk about heaven, it's almost like they view heaven as an escape hatch to get out of having to love their enemies. Because they have this sense that there will be some people who are in and some people who are out, and wouldn't you know it, all of their enemies in the Christian's mind are out, and all of their friends are in. So they say to God, I know you asked us to love your enemies, but I got to get the world ready for your soon return, and please come back soon so I don't have to spend time loving this person. And I understand why Christians do this, because loving our enemies is by far the most difficult task in the Christian tradition. There's nothing harder that Jesus asks of us. There's nothing more painful, more time-consuming, more just difficult to figure out than how it is that we love someone who is against us. Now, I have found that it would be much easier if my enemies walked around looking like enemies, so that way everyone would be like, that guy's an enemy. Can you imagine how easy it would be if my enemies walked around looking like this? Sauron from Lord of the Rings? They'd be like, who do you have a problem with? I'd be like, Sauron. They'd be like, me too, right? There's no way we don't have a problem with this guy. Imagine that our villains, the people who are enemies to us, look like Gore the God Butcher or Darth Vader. It would be so much easier, right? Because when people say, why don't you like that guy? Let's say, look at the way they dress. I'm supposed to not like that guy. Now, there are times of war, and I've been fortunate enough to not live through those, and I'm grateful for whatever happened before that I can live in a time that is absent of war where something like this happens. But I have found that this is not my experience. Instead, I have found that the people I consider enemies are people who I once opened my arms wide to, and they have become my enemies shortly after that was rejected. Anytime we open our arms wide, we are exposing our vulnerabilities and opening ourselves to be hurt by someone. Now, that is a painful journey. And that painful journey often leads us to feel a deep sense of anger. And we have this idea that there's no way that we can be angry at our enemy if we're called to love our enemies. And I will tell you, I have not found that to be true. I have not found it to be true because of the philosophical film that came out about 10 years ago called Crazy Stupid Love. In this movie, the main character, played by Steve Carell, is given a speech, and he's given a speech to his wife in front of a bunch of people, and he's really had a hard time reconciling with her. And he gives this beautiful speech, and one of the main points of his speech is he says to his wife, "I have loved my wife even when I hated her. Only married couples will understand that one." And I remember seeing that and being like, I don't want to say that I understand that one, but I think I do. And I wouldn't even say out loud that I hate my wife, but I will tell you, I have never stopped loving my wife even when I'm angry with her. And it's hard to believe, but she probably at some point in our marriage has been angry at me, right? I would guess that she would say that she did not stop loving me while she was angry with me. It is possible to love someone and be angry with them at the same time. Love your enemies should never be used to repress my emotions. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be hurt. It's okay to feel betrayed by the whole thing and question whether or not God is actually good because of this. None of that is a violation of the command to love my enemies. Your emotions need to breathe and need to have space. And all of that is independent, in my opinion, from what it means to love one's enemies. I used to have this idea that to love an enemy, that it really hurt me, the only way I could truly love them is if I invited them over to dinner at my house, and we had this big kumbaya moment where we started crying and we all apologized and we all got back on the same page. I have to tell you, I haven't found life to be that accommodating. Now, it's here that someone may say, Craig, but that's what Jesus did. He didn't invite tax collectors to his house, but he went to a tax collector named Zacchaeus and invited himself to Zacchaeus' house. To which I would say, of course he did. But it's important to remember the context that Jesus was in. Tax collectors were suffering from social isolation. So he had to go out and start breaking the barriers of that social isolation because he passionately believed this was the way forward to relating to and loving these tax collectors again. Now, my enemy is most likely not experiencing social isolation. For instance, a tax collector had to spend all the holidays alone, wasn't invited to birthday parties, wasn't part of any big announcement. The people I know as my enemies are part of their own social network. They're not dining alone every night. They've got friends, they've got birthday parties, they've got family members. They're all doing their thing, and it's not like they need that from me. And I think that's really important to draw this distinguishing line because what I have found to be true is that loving my enemy is not about my proximity to my enemy. Rather, it's about my posture toward my enemy. It's how I think about them, how I speak about them when they're not around. It's how I understand them. It's how I act toward them when I hear that something good happened to them. It's not about proximity. It's about my posture toward my enemy. And while there are enemies who sometimes fade away or get out of our lives completely, there are other enemies who are very much in our life, whether it's a family member or a close friend that you just can't seem to avoid. And some of the best advice I've ever received is to look at what it is that I am willing to hold and what it is that I am willing to let go. Because I will tell you, I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. I'm pretty sure that you have too. And I've learned that the more honest I can be about those mistakes and own the times that I messed up, the further I get things moving along to making things better. However, I've also done this thing where I've said that I'm sorry for things that I'm not actually sorry for, or I've owned up to things that I didn't actually mean or do. And I found that that never made things better. And so what I have learned is that I will always own what is mine, and I will also disown what is not. I will admit where I messed up, and if somebody else feels like I made a mistake that I don't feel like I did, I will not own up to that. Now, I have therapists and mentors who help me sort through when I've been wrong. I love them enough to tell me when I've been wrong, and I trust them to tell me. But I found this advice of owning what is yours and disowning what is not has been very helpful in processing how to love my enemies. Because I wish it was easier, right? I wish it was like sports events where we could go and say, oh, there's a clear winner and a clear loser. Those guys are the enemies because they're not dressed like us. We're this team together and we're fighting for the common good of our tribe. This is why I think sports is so appealing. It's very simple. You have a winner, you have a loser every time people step on the field, and it's very obvious what the objective is. But I have found what happens is that enemies often try to force us or force each other into win-lose scenarios, where there's a clear winner and a clear loser, and they're trying to be the winner, and you're trying to be and they're trying to make you the loser. I have found that most people try to respond with their own win-lose scenario or play their enemy's game and try to be the winner. I have not found that to be helpful. I believe that loving my enemy is responding to this with a win-win scenario. If you have the courage to be able to ask, what's a win for me and a win for them, it is both an opportunity to tell yourself that you are loving toward yourself and loving toward them. And it's a painful question to ask, but I have found it to be worthwhile every time. And you may look at this, you may say to yourself, have I done a good job at loving my enemy? I will tell you that's a very valuable question to ask. But whatever you do, do not allow certain people to grade your ability to love your enemy. Specifically, my enemy does not get to grade me on my ability to love them. If I based all of my ability to love them on their opinion, I would fail every time. Now, this may sound discouraging. We do make mistakes, but I love what Jesus says at the end of this passage when he says, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. The thing about loving your enemy is you're playing a long-term game. There's not a lot of short-term games here. It's all about thinking way down in the future how you want to be remembered by your kids or your family or the ones that you love, and how you can respond to the best in a very difficult situation. Loving your enemy always, always, always takes patience. And along this journey, I will tell you that I have found that I often question whether or not loving my enemy is the right thing or not. And what I have found is that loving my enemy is a long-term solution, and this journey requires faith. And I say that specifically because I have to trust Jesus when Jesus says it's worthwhile to love your enemy. There are days I don't know if that's actually the case. And so I trust the words of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, in order to believe that this is worth continuing to invest time in, even when I cannot see it on that journey. Now, I know a lot of people want to try to get out of this obligation as Christians to love their enemies. And so people love to label their enemies with certain adjectives. The one I've heard most recently over and over again is the word toxic. I've heard Christians use the word toxic to describe people a lot lately. Now, what's interesting is if you go to the American Psychological Association's dictionary, which they have one online, and you type in toxic or toxic person, you will get this response. Sorry, toxic person is not in the dictionary of psychology. Now, this is really stunning to me because I was sure that it was a label that psychologists love. But then I went to therapy with a psychologist, and I tried to label some people as toxic, and she was like, no, don't do that. And I said, I'm sorry, am I paying you or are you paying me? There's no such thing as a literally toxic person. So I tried other words with my therapist. I was like, well, this person is malicious. He's bad, she's bad, they're all bad. She's like, no, stop doing that. And I said, what do you mean? She's like, it will not help you to call someone malicious. It will not help you to call someone terrible. It will not help you to call them toxic. And I was like, what, are you serious? And she said, it will just make you angrier and write them off even more, and you will just be stuck in your anger. What I have learned is that labeling my enemy with terms that assume the worst about them does not help. But I have some good news. There is something that helps. And we got to go back about 200 years ago to the mid-19th century when a man named Robert Vischer, a German psychologist, introduced a brand new word to the German language. It's called Einfühlung. Let me hear you say Einfühlung this morning. That's better German than I have, that's for sure. This literally translates to English as feeling into. And while Vischer is the one that introduced it, someone later than him, a German psychologist, Theodor Lipps, came up with this word or started using this word in like really profound ways. It got the attention of an English psychologist, a man named Edward Titchener, and he was like, English needs an Einfühlung in their own language. Like, we're missing out by not having this. And so in 1909, Edward Titchener introduced a new word into the English language, empathy. First time it was used was 1909. Now, his definition was the capacity of human beings to be in tune with another's emotions and to know and understand one another through reflection and shared experience. I tell you this because empathy is a brand new idea in modern consciousness. And while it may be jarring to hear Jesus say, love your enemies, I have a feeling that if Jesus was here today and speaking in English, he would come to Paradox and say, like, let's go out on a mountain and give a sermon there. So we go to the Appleton Ranch where we go every Easter, and Jesus would be preaching, and about a third of the way through, I think he'd be using English in this hypothetical situation. I think that he would change the wording just a little bit. I think he would say, love your enemies with empathy. I have found that empathy is the absolute best tool we have for understanding how to love our enemies. And that the path to loving our enemies is paved with empathy. Now, these are not big, grand gestures, right? It can be the tiniest shred of empathy you could possibly imagine. For instance, something along the lines of, wow, their marriage must be really tough right now. It could be something as simple as, I'm not sure they even understand why they're doing what they're doing. It can be as small as, I know how much stress they're dealing with the death of their father. I can understand why they did this. It doesn't excuse it. It's just a small understanding, and I will tell you this has been life-changing for me. I believe that empathy is the path to learning how to love our enemies. And so, my friends, my wish for you this morning is that you may have faith, and may your faith inspire you to trust the most difficult teaching of Jesus, and may you find the courage to love your enemies with empathy. Amen. Such a nice song. The harmonies really trip out the musicians. They can't figure them out. And I'm like, I just know there's harmonies, so there's that.
So Craig, this is a difficult one because enemies are named that for good reason. You know?
Yeah.
So my first question is, you know, I feel like this empathy conversation, this loving conversation, is an intellectual and logical one when you have some type of perspective. So when you are kind of under someone's foot and they're on your neck and really all you want to do is punch them in the face, metaphorically speaking.
Yeah, right,
you know,
okay.
Metaphorically speaking.
Asking for a friend.
Yes. How do you fast forward to that perspective? Is there something that we can do to gain kind of that perspective to get into that logical phase?
I think that right there, I would stop someone and say, we need to pause on that word fast forward. This is not an overnight process. Like, it's not like your enemy attacks you, and then all of a sudden, like, the next day, you're like, well, Jesus told me to love my enemies, so we're all good now, right? This is a journey and a process, and I think it's good to have in mind what the end goal looks like. Like, okay, maybe it's not me having them over for dinner, but maybe it's I don't wake up every day thinking about them. Or someone says their name, and I don't instantly think like, oh, I hope something bad happens. So if you go 3 days without thinking about them, celebrate that. Like, and you know, you'll be caught off guard because you'll start thinking about them again. You'll be like, oh, maybe I should celebrate that because that was one of my goals. I think that us paying attention to what we want to get to is really helpful. And then also having a lot of patience with ourselves, because the whole reason this is difficult is because you've been hurt. And it's okay if you're really hurt one day, not so hurt the next day, and then hurt even more the day after, even though nothing's changed. So we're human beings. We have beating hearts. We have eyes that cry. And I think that we have to just acknowledge that this is not going to be a linear journey.
So the word enemies, I'm a definitions person.
Yeah.
So the word enemies, it has many definitions and how we interpret them. Enemies could be a very big oppressor, it could be an abuser, it could be someone who is not sorry for how they're treating you and they're treating you very unjustly. So what does it mean to love someone who is not sorry and you're actively being torn down by them? Mm-hmm. Is it loving afar? Like, what is that definition of loving, and what are the actions as Christians we are called to do in that scenario?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's really important to point out, Jesus doesn't say, love your enemies only if they're sorry. And I think that we often give away our own happiness or own identity as a loving person because we expect something from someone else before we can be who God has called us to be. And I think that's what Jesus is trying to break through at this point, is he's trying to remind us that we are grounded as loving beings, and no matter how bad your enemy has treated you, you can still find a way to be a loving person and experience love in this life. Obviously, I'm white, cisgender, heterosexual. There's a lot of oppression and pain from enemies that have been caused from people that look like me, or pain and oppression that I haven't been aware of, that I've never had to face, which of course is an injustice. That's why I would encourage you to always listen to diverse perspectives. There are women who have talked about overcoming misogyny and finding, that a man's bad behavior didn't define them for the rest of their life. You've seen all sorts of different things, whether it's Archbishop Tutu or other people who have gone through stuff that is just cringy to read their experience, and they've somehow found a way to find that life is good. My guess is if you could get them off the record and you were sitting down and you had a relationship with them, they would not tell you that everyone's a great person. They would say, though, that they've found a way to still be a loving person in spite of that other person. And they wouldn't, I think that they'd be at the point where they just can say, I wish them nothing but the best, which is sometimes as far as love can take us. And I think that that's a lot farther than some people have been currently, and I think that's possible for everyone.
Can we define that love? So does love mean interaction? Does it mean relationship? What does loving mean with that oppression?
Yeah, I think it's a posture more than anything. And for me, that posture is just an understanding that I live with love. I have been hurt. I will do my best to make sure I don't get hurt that way again. And at the same time, it's a posture as you interact with your close friends and family that understand the pain that you've gone through, and you can say a bit more That's also a posture as you start to go out in public circles and you speak to people out there about what your experience has been like. I think there's varying levels there. I think that in therapy, you can be loving and just say the worst things possible about your enemy there, because we all have to have those environments. And therapy is just a space where you can say anything without any consequence. So I think that embracing those environments and understanding where they are, and also forgiving yourself when you've misread an environment, and making amends when you need to, I think it's more about a posture with yourself than it is dependent on your enemy's behavior or response to who you are, would be the way that I would answer that.
So not necessarily does this loving process change anything for the enemy.
I think that if you give that away, you will probably be disappointed, I would say 99 times out of 100. There is the 1 out of 100 that happens, and I think it's possible. So I want anyone to know, if you feel like you're estranged from a family member, I would never say that it will never happen that you can reconcile. I do believe that good things can happen and people can change. I think that it's important, though, to keep your expectations in check and to never allow someone else to determine your own happiness, and for you to do the best you can, regardless of what they're doing.
Should we get to some
Yeah, let's do it.
questions? Yeah.
Let's do it. Those were great questions, by the way, Olivia.
Okay, instead of toxic, how about abusive?
So abuse is tough. There's no other way to say it. I will tell you, I personally have not been physically abused. And my heart breaks for anyone that has. And for me to say that you can't label someone abusive is then me coming in, like in that hierarchy that we saw, it's me moving up and saying you can't call someone abusive. So I want you to know I'm sorry. I want you to know there are mentors who have gone through this that can share that with you. There are therapists who can help you with that language. I would feel very bad standing in front of you, though, and saying abusive is something that you shouldn't say when I haven't gone through it myself. So that's the only reason I would hold off on that specific word. The toxic one, though, I'm very happy to talk about because I have been called toxic myself. I have also called other people toxic. I'm here among all of you as a friend, and I would say to that, I just haven't found it to be helpful at all. Great question.
Get to another one. Okay, how do you reconcile anger toward your enemies if you have to encounter them on a daily basis and cannot have space?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So for instance, Calvin Thompson, who is my counseling professor at La Sierra in seminary, he said to me, when you get divorced, when you don't have kids, you get divorced from someone. When you get divorced from someone when you have kids, you get divorced to them. So you have to continue to interact with them. There's no way around it, and not all divorces are amicable, as we all know, right? Amicable. And so I think that when it comes to that requires a lot of nuance. I mean, you have to constantly remind yourself that I will not allow their bad behavior to dictate how I behave, and it will feel like you're losing every time. And you will question, am I doing the right thing here by not lowering myself to a level and fighting back? I will tell you, I've been there. I may currently be there on some things. And I would say to that, it's just this constant commitment to saying, I will not allow their bad behavior to dictate who I am, because I believe I am a loving person created in God's image, and I will always call myself back to that. This is why we did the Q&A on this one, is because these are the questions I know people have.
So love is very abstract. What does the action of love look like? Isn't it different for different situations?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it's different for different situations. And that's why it's hard for me to say love for your enemies looks like this, because there's all these different situations that are represented here, right? And so for me to say your love for your enemy needs to look like this, well, when Jesus was talking about loving tax collectors, it was going to their house and having dinner with them, which I never have recommended in pastoral ministry to anyone who's struggling with an enemy, and I probably never will. So it does depend on the situation, and that's why it's important to work through solutions and not just venting all the time with the people who can help you figure out what the best way forward is.
I love what you're saying, because basically loving does not mean putting yourself in harm's way.
No, yeah, and you should never have to love your enemy at the expense of yourself. Now, you can obviously love yourself too much at the expense of your enemy. That's a different conversation. But you shouldn't have to like say things that are dishonest to your enemy to make them happy. You shouldn't have to just be a doormat that is willing to give someone whatever they want. You should always love yourself while you are also trying to hold love for your enemy in whatever space that is.
Okay, I get that the Jews were heavily persecuted. Does that mean you need to continue to open yourself to abusive people?
So once again, there's that abusive word, which physical harm, I would say, space is necessary, period. There are healthy boundaries. There are also harsh and cruel boundaries. And I think that I've heard little discussion about the harsh and cruel boundaries as opposed to people saying, I need to set up boundaries. I look at that, and there are people that you have to constantly open yourselves to. There are other people that you can go put a little bit of space between you and see them every now and then, and there are people that you can leave completely. At the same time, if you're angry toward them and wishing bad things and like constantly thinking about them, I would say that's more of the concern about loving our enemy and the part that we're missing out on than like a specific action of drawing closer to them. For me, at the very least, loving your enemy is wanting something good for them in a different phase or a different walk of life. I feel like that is like kind of the ground floor of loving your enemies. Should we do one more?
Okay, how do you see restorative justice as a guide for conflict resolution between enemies?
Oh, so restorative justice is the idea that instead of punishing somebody that they've done something wrong, like our whole legal system is that instead, when they've done something wrong, you think to yourself, how do I restore this person to society in a way that they don't want to do something like this again? I think that restorative justice always has to start with there are no unforgivable sins. Because if the idea is that some sins get restorative and some sins don't, that's a major problem because all of a sudden that line will keep moving to whatever it is that you want. So it has to start with like this universal acceptance that there is nothing that would cause me to say that this person needs to be put away in prison for the rest of my life, which is obviously a challenge for us as Americans, but the longest prison sentence in Germany is 14 years. And so that's a different system. I'm not saying it's better. I will say our system is pretty broken. But I think that when it comes to restorative justice and how it begins with a conflict resolution or a guide, it's reminding yourself like this person did something very bad. However, if they say they're sorry to you and they want to be restored, it's not you holding it over their head all the time, is the first thing. If they never say they're sorry and they live their own life, it's you being willing to say, I will make sure that I never do that again. And if I do, I will take the steps necessary to make it right because I know how painful this is. So that's what I would say is restorative justice. Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. We're going to have a few questions up here, and then we'll sing one last song.
Chasing of the wind, the powers of the earth, so pale and thin, we will set our hearts on you again.
We can feel it from within, the beauty of it all, the mystery, the swelling of a voice, a rising sea. Holy, you, oh God, are holy. Trees clap their hands for you, oceans they dance for you. You are holy. Oh, the mystery of it all. I can never peer within, can never find the words or understand the fullness of a God become a man. Holy, you, oh God, are holy. Trees clap their hands for you, oceans they dance for you. You are holy, infinite and holy. A billion suns rise for you, clouds paint the skies for you, mountains stand tall for you, valleys bow down to you, everything rising to, we sing all our songs to you. Holy, the impossible and holy. Kingdom come falls for you, kingdoms to ruins for you. Vapor finds ground in you, music finds sound in you. Everything rising, everything rising, oh, everything rising together. Holy, you, oh God, are holy. Trees clap their hands for you, oceans they dance for you. You are holy.
Let's close our time here in prayer. Dear God, This morning we are sitting with the most difficult thing you ask us to do, to love our enemies. Lord, give us the space we need to process and validate our emotions. Give us the mentors and therapists we can trust to tell us when we are wrong. Give us the patience and endurance to trust that loving our enemies is for the betterment of all. And give us the courage to practice empathy, even when we do not feel like practicing empathy at all. In the human name of Jesus and the eternal name of Christ, amen. Thank you for coming, everyone, and we hope to see you all next week.